Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to ELLICSR and to all of you for being here this morning on a Monday morning, bright and early, to learn more about caregiving and supporting and receiving of care. I very deliberately titled this talk Caregiving and Receiving because I think we've all been on both sides of that equation in different ways, and I think it's appropriate because coping doesn't occur in a vacuum, as you all are well aware. And although I think of this often, that although the disease may be located in one person's body, the illness is always going to be a shared experience. And it may be shared between a couple in an intimate relationship, as a family, certainly if you have a very close friend with cancer, between adult children and parents, and vice versa, children and parents and children. So you're always, in a way, for better or for worse, I think of cancer as a communal kind of event. So what I'm going to be talking about today is this exchange of care. And I'd like to begin this talk with a quote by a well-known marriage therapist and relationship expert by the name of Daphne de Marneff. And she says, and I think she just sort of cuts to the heart of the matter, she says, "We depend on our bodies just as we depend on other people. And like other people, our bodies aren't entirely under our control. They let us down, they get sick, they die. What helps us face these realities is love." So what I'll be speaking about today is really the power of our closest relationships and what the sociologists refer to as social capital, and how that can be leveraged in a way that not only helps the identified patient, but also all participants in any relationship in order to make sure that we have as good an outcome as possible in relation to a very difficult, often traumatizing life event. And also I want to talk about what will not only allow for better outcomes, but also how things that we shouldn't do as well as do in order to cope as effectively as possible as in our relationships. And the first point I'll make is that every relationship, basically I think of it as its own shared universe. It's got its own language, inside jokes. You know, the people closest to you have this wonderful collection of shared memories. You have your own private rituals, perhaps, or traditions, shared history, and a whole world of intricate idiosyncratic knowledge about each other that an outsider wouldn't necessarily know about. And what this allows us to do is it enables us to read each other quite well. And I think to our benefit, really, when we're trying to engage with each other and help each other through a difficult life event like cancer. And so when couples are, and families are resilient, I think what they're doing is they're drawing on this shared history that they have and capitalizing on all of those accumulated experiences of handling previous problems, adversities, and that so forth. And that one of the keys to the success is that while you're handling all the practicalities of the illness, so where cancer is concerned, getting to and from appointments, managing through chemotherapy, going to the radiation daily for some people, all those things, these relationships, these people who are in their intimate relationships or close supporters to their loved ones, they don't lose sight of who they are as a family, as a couple, as a relationship system. So while you're juggling all these other practical demands, and that can be very physically demanding for the patient especially, we're not losing sight of the relationship as a whole and the system. This comes from a study, this is a patient perspective. It comes from a study that I did of couples where the man in the couple was coping with prostate cancer. And I'll just read this quote to you. He talks about what it was like for him when he was first diagnosed with the disease. And he says, "I just couldn't adjust to it. I couldn't handle it. I went outside and I broke down and I cried. But after I think about 3, 4, 5 days, logic began to kick in. And we said, well, let's find out what the hell we got here. We were hooked up to the net, and within 2 weeks, his partner and I knew more about prostate cancer than the average physician." So thinking about relationships as cultures, here we have a couple that was a very project-oriented couple. And so you can see that coming to fruition here, playing out here as they handle cancer. But I also want to highlight another point, which is this couple did not anticipate becoming prostate cancer experts. It wasn't something that they chose. Cancer is never something one expects or wants. That's a curveball that they were thrown. And yet, because it was the curveball they were thrown, it had to become their focus. And they had to make it they had to make room for it, essentially, in the relationship. And I think of this as a kind of like, you might have heard about the figure ground kind of phenomenon, where sometimes when we're living our daily lives, we have the luxury of being able to, think about the mundane things, like what we're going to make for dinner, or shuffling your children from one place to another, or what you're planning for your next vacation, or what do you want to cook for Christmas dinner, etc. But when we're under the grips of a life-threatening illness, that commands our attention. So suddenly what was in the background has to become the focus of our attention, such as when a person's seriously ill. So I'm going to take us somewhere unexpectedly, perhaps, because I think there's an actual analogy, because we're essentially allowed to forget our bodies in a way. Like our bodies are handmaidens to all the stuff we want to get accomplished. Our work, our family time, our enjoyment, our pleasure. When we're going to an art museum and taking in these gorgeous masterpieces, we're not thinking about our bodies necessarily. And in a way, it's a privilege to get to forget about our bodies when they're functioning well. But as anyone, even let's say cancer aside, when you've been hit by a flu bug, or you suddenly have developed tennis elbow, or like my partner, plantar fasciitis not too long ago, then all those things that we normally attend to, we have to make that the focus of our attention instead. So for me, there's a driving analogy. I think we can make this compare it to driving down, let's say, a country road. And here we have one that happens to be in Tuscany. So you thought you were coming to downtown Toronto this morning, but I'm going to transport you momentarily to Italy, where I actually had the pleasure of traveling this past summer. And so you're traveling along this wonderful road and taking in these lovely sights. You see the patchwork quilt. I think of this as a patchwork quilt of vineyards and olive groves and cypress trees. It really is idyllic. And then suddenly you start to experience that dreaded sensation. I don't know if anyone else has ever had a flat tire, but it's like that ka-tunk, 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 da-dum. Like it's the dreaded flat. And it's at that point that you have to pull over to the side of the road and attend to the tire. We weren't thinking much about our cars or their tires until that moment, and yet there we are having to attend to it. So in a way, we think of this as our bodies are our handmaiden to us, and now we sort of have to be a handmaiden to it. And so here we have the focal point now becoming the tire, not the beautiful Tuscan countryside. But the point I want to raise here is that there's also a relationship occurring. It's important not to lose sight of this relationship. They have to actually be engaging in some pretty important things too while the tire is being attended to, like open communication, mutual support, attentiveness, although she looks a little bit put out by the tire. And cooperation. So although in this case, I'm missing a title there. Okay, didn't make it. So although in this case, our body, or in the case of cancer, might be the focal point, it's really, really important. I would encourage everyone to not lose sight of who you are in your closest relationships and how you're relating to each other, and let that also be foregrounded despite the disease having to be attended to. So I want to shift here and just talk about what makes relationships resilient during times of distress and hardship and adversity, essentially. And actually, I'm drawing here on work that I did with a collaborator from Chicago, Karen Scarrett. We we edited a book about couple resilience. And even though this was focused on intimate relationships, I think what you'll find is that sort of the ingredients that we ultimately deduced that was important to resiliency could be applied to all types of relationships. And there was the title of there somewhere. So essentially, I'll just walk us through these. So for sure, the degree to which you can muster mutual empathy, mutual sharing of your vulnerabilities, your respective vulnerabilities, and I'm going to come back to this because that's not always easy to do. Compassion for one another, your respect for each other. Having another element of resilience is having that awareness of yourself and the other and the relationship as a whole, and allowing yourselves to be open and receptive to what's occurring from all sides of the equation. A continual consideration and prioritization of the relationship. And somebody might say, well, I think it's more important to prioritize the other or myself. Actually, we more often hear about prioritizing the other. And I would argue that when you prioritize the relationship, you're actually prioritizing both partners at the same time. So it's very efficient to think about that. So for example, if you make a point of, it was a beautiful afternoon yesterday or before the rain happened, taking some time to go for a walk or plan a date night if you're with your partner, those sorts of things, that's a prioritizing of the relationship that actually could be helpful to both of you ultimately, or would be helpful to both. And also building positivity into the relationship, so doing some things that are extra special, maybe out of the ordinary, but a way of just creating these little nice surprises for each other. And laughter, of course, is really important. And also this backdrop of safety and trust. When we think about our closest relationships that function the best, they really ultimately, bottom line, I think, they need to have that fundamental sense of, I can trust you to be there for me. And trust actually is not just, not betraying, me or it's in those big ways. It can be very small, like, I've asked you to, would you mind going and picking up X, Y, and Z because I have to tend to something important to me right now, and trusting that your partner or your best friend or your child, your adult child, will be willing to kind of go out of their way to be helpful to you. So trust can be a whole, John Gottman talks a lot about this, it's the little things as well as the bigger things. And this, again, the storehouse of accumulated wisdom that each of you in your long-term relationships, no matter what type of relationship it is, you will have had, because no doubt by the time you get to a cancer diagnosis, you've also had not necessarily the pleasure, but certainly the life experience under your belt to handle other adversities, perhaps other types of illness, chronic illness or acute illness, or perhaps a difficult pregnancy or a loss of a job. All of those types of adversities create a kind of like I think of it like money in the bank in a way that you can now draw upon in dealing with this new adversity in cancer. And lastly, there's this important factor, which is unified meaning making. And what this means is basically the couple or the family system, in a really resilient relationship system, you're actually looking at the illness in a similar way. And you're developing a shared, even if maybe initially you might be having differences, ultimately if you can kind of work your way towards a shared construction of what this means to us, that can be a very powerful tool in coping. And just to give you an example, one of my other projects was I developed with my colleagues an online platform for young couples affected by breast cancer. So the woman had had breast cancer. It was for heterosexual couples. And really the men were often, and Jennifer and I have talked about this over the years, they often feel kind of like fish out of water. They're not being addressed. This was a program that was intended to address both partners. So again, I look at it from the other side as well, that if we can offer support to the relationship system, it's a way of very efficiently supporting both partners in the relationship simultaneously. That aside, basically, in a nutshell, it was like an online course that the couples enrolled in. It was called Couple Links, and they were walked through a series of different exercises that were designed to really enhance their relationship bond. And one of those exercises, because we know this to be very important about meaning making, was we had the couples assign a metaphor to their experience with cancer. So it could have been, for example, for one couple, it might have been climbing a really treacherous mountain, or weathering a really hard storm, or really turbulent seas. They all had different metaphors they were drawing on, and then we actually asked them to to collectively develop a shared image. So using their creativity, maybe it could be in text, it could be a collage, it could be an image of some sort, but they were able to create a metaphor plus a creative expression. And I'm just going to share with you one of these couples. This was a couple who was diagnosed relatively early on in their relationship. And by the way, that's one of the difficult things for younger couples, is that they don't necessarily have as much of that accumulated wisdom and life experience under their belt to draw on. So they're a little bit more vulnerable than if you've been married for 40 years and find yourself having to deal with cancer. But I'm going to read to you the poem that this couple constructed. And again, they were stricken with this illness before they were married. So the poem goes: although they already knew that all the things they'd go through would be hard to overcome, it had only just begun. With a little lump inside her breast and hard beats inside his chest, with worry and uncertainty, but also strength, luckily. Because they learned a thing or two about what they could really do to fight the fight and work it out and see what it's all about, to love someone no matter what, without an if or and or but. With all they learned and taught themselves, they experienced wedding bells. Having gone through this ordeal, they know that their love is real. And though marriage is give and take, for them it'll be a piece of cake. So this really was, I always get shivers up the back of my spine when I read that lovely poem. And in fact, Janelle and Kareem were a wonderful contributor to the Couple Links program and website, and drew heavily on their story and shared their story in order to help other couples. So the 4 pillars of effective coping in close relationships. I'm sure there's many more, but everyone likes a package, so I'm going to give you a package of 4 pillars. The first is, I alluded to this before, making room for the illness and a kind of acceptance of it. And I know that's not always easy. But it really essentially what one of my colleagues used to say to her patients, she was a nurse practitioner, she talked about how she would say, "This is your job right now." And for as much as it was hard to hear, I think her patients really appreciated that, because it just it sort of freed them up to make that the focus. And for as much as it's upending so many aspects of your life, and for sure there's so many losses and complexities that have to be dealt with, and anxiety, it does have a way of commanding your attention, and so it's important to give it that. Now, Daphne de Marneff, who I was quoting earlier, she talks about illness almost as a third person, to think about it as a third person in the relationship. And it has its own desires, its own demands, its own disposition. And in fact, we have to make a space for it, for much as you don't want to. And I think you can associate that this can be related to all sorts of facets of one's life, good and bad, right? When a child comes, you have to make a space for that new family member. When you're maybe for a job, or for me, I recently had shingles torn off my roof. Like, that had to become the focus for that time. So you have to make space for the illness. It was requiring your attention. The other one is mobilizing your social network, and many of you will do this. This is getting back to that social capital I was just talking about, that network of family and friends, your community groups and organizations, religious organizations such as your church or your mosque or your synagogue. Mobilize. Don't be shy about putting that into action. You will have been there for others. They want to be there for you. Retaining your sense of humor. I know some, especially if this is part of your shared relationship culture, and as a couples counselor and therapist, I can tell you that just about every couple I've ever encountered has that humor somewhere in there, all those inside jokes, those things. In fact, when cancer comes around, it can actually be a very kind of dark humor, but humor nonetheless, a gallows type humor. And exercising this aspect of your relationship, I think, can be really helpful so long as it is not perceived by the other person as in any way being minimizing or inappropriate. But when you are able to use humor effectively, it has this wonderful way of basically saying we're all on the same page here. It's a very potent tool because it also allows you to kind of step outside and say, we're bigger than this. And this is exactly what one of my the spouses in one of my studies said about her use of humor with her partner. The humor gives us perspective, it really does. It shows us this is not everything, cancer is not everything, that there's more, that we're more. And so we can joke about it because it's still us and we're still here. Oh, I'm going to just back up a second. So something was really interesting. Molly McCarthy, one of my graduate students, did her master's thesis. She interviewed couples where one partner, be it male or female or both, was living with a permanent ostomy. And we wanted to understand, how do couples adjust to that? Because it's a couple issue. It's not just a single person's problem in a sense. And what was so fascinating was, who would have known that these couples actually do name their ostomies? And it's this, so we had a couple, one was named Bob, one was named Crazy Bertha, and we think, so it's a way of both using humor, but also saying, okay, you know, you're a bit irritable or irritating or in many ways inconveniencing of us, but we know you're here, so here, Bertha, we'll give you a place in our lives for now. The last point I'm going to raise is finding your rhythm as caregivers and receivers. And again, I'm going to drive home this point that we've all been on both sides of this equation. Just because one of you may be more in the limelight right now, so to speak, because of having cancer, it does not mean that you're unfamiliar with the caregiving role. And also, I think receivers makes it, rather than patients, but I'll use both interchangeably, but by the way, as a patient, you can do a whole lot as a care receiver that can make the caregiver's job much less onerous, and I want to talk about that too. So I'm going to talk about both sides of that equation. So becoming better caregivers and receivers, this is just a little illustration or schematization that just basically says, think of yourselves as being on both sides of this equation and that you're both helping each other depending on how well you enact or assume your respective roles here. So I think actually caregivers and receivers actually share a lot in common. I think in oncology we talk a lot about the differences in these roles, but I would argue that actually there's a whole lot that you're sharing together and have in common. And this one point is, well, there's a few. The similarities include both of you will be experiencing a loss of control, or all of you in the family if it's the case, sense of helplessness. There's a lot of anxiety about the future, fear of loss and losses you're contending with. So think about it just even from the get-go. If you've had a surgery, you may have lost a body part. There may be a function that you've now had to grapple with no longer having, such as sexual dysfunction, for example, or maybe you've actually lost the capacity to have a child, to bear children. There's so many losses associated with cancer, and consequently, there's a lot of grief associated with cancer. Again, on the behalf of all members of the relationship system. And also both partners, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues who work with both sides of the relationship and patients and caregivers know this really well. They're really working very hard to be strong for the other person. And that's not a bad thing, but it can actually backfire a little, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So the relationship challenges that are associated with helplessness, and again, from both perspectives. So one of the traps for caregivers, or I guess not a trap, let's just say initially it's an impulse to take control. So when I'm feeling helpless as a caregiver, I want to take control. and to fix and to advise. And I remember this in my own experience with my father when he had lung cancer. I was right on the smoothie bandwagon. I was feeding him these green concoctions, and he was just looking at them going, like, shaking his head. It didn't go very far, needless to say. But that was me trying to take charge, take control, fix, and basically revamp my father's way of living. So from the patient perspective, there's increased dependency. And not wanting to ask for help is a huge component to, I think, being a patient, and also feeling like a burden. I'm sure maybe a few head nods in the room, but I think a lot of the people I've spoken with over the years can really relate to not wanting to be a burden. And then, of course, wanting to feel strong for the other. So I want to talk about that when we're putting on the strong front, that you can either ultimately, if you're both trying to be doing too much for each other, you can actually get into this contest of wills. It becomes like a power struggle. So you can either actually have a tug of war occurring between patient and caregiver, or a dance. And I'd like to think more of this caregiving and receiving as a dance rather than a tug of war, frankly, a power struggle. So caregiving. So one of the things I would like to educate you about is this notion of helplessness, and one of the most pronounced feelings is that. And actually there's a whole lot of research that's gone into this notion of what Miller and Rolnick, William Miller and Stephen Rolnick have called the writing reflex. I don't know if you can imagine any facet of your life. You've seen somebody, the writing is on the wall, you need to tell them they need to get their life back on track, and in this way, for those of you that ever raised an adolescent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Lots of advice on lots of things I want to dole out to you. And so in the case of cancer, it can be very obvious, like I'm going to stick you on a macrobiotic diet, we're all changing our diet, or we're all going to start juicing, or we're going to invest the money in an infrared sauna, etc. We're going to travel, etc., to find the most obscure treatments, but we're going to do our best to find these things. There's the obvious advice giving, and then there's the subtle, just think positive. I know that doesn't sound like much, it's huge. It's huge in many ways because sometimes you don't feel very positive, but you're advising the person in that quick moment to just be positive, or don't give it a second thought, everything's going to be okay. That's little micro moments of advice giving and writing. You're writing R-I-G-H-T in that moment. And of course, sometimes these suggestions are well received, and it feels like, okay, this is exactly, I needed to be talked down, I needed to have hope, I'm glad you said that, I needed that in this moment. But there's a lot of times when they're not so well received, and rather than the patient feeling supported and understood, they end up feeling pressured and misunderstood. So we find ourselves in the midst of this tug of war. Now, self-determination theory, so why is that? What's going on here? Well, again, a very well researched construct in psychology is this notion that we really need to exercise our free will, to be autonomous in all of our choices, and to exercise our free will is a deep-seated need, even when we're in the role of patient. And so it's really connected to our sense of being competent in the world, that sense of self-efficacy and mastery, and also it ties in with our feeling of belonging and mattering to others. So this deep need for autonomy can be expressed in countless ordinary ways, like I want to get up and walk my dog, or go for a run, or preparing meals, what do I want to eat, or even self-expression. How do I want to dress? What choices do I want to have for my meals, etc., or even right down to what I think and believe. I don't want to be dictated to, mostly. I would rather come to that myself, because that's an expression of my autonomy. So the moment we're told what to do, that will naturally evoke this inner rebel that we all have, and even if, and this is what's so fascinating, even if a part of us agrees. So even if I should stop biting my nails because of X, Y, and Z, if you tell me I'm supposed to do that, I'm going to go gnawing away. So it's we're very delicately balanced in this way, and that means the caregiver's task is also a delicate one. So advice, however well delivered, can clash with that drive and desire for autonomy. So there's a balance I want to encourage all of us to strike between not undermining the other person's autonomy and providing support. It's a dynamic dance where sometimes we lead and sometimes we follow. It means paying attention as caregivers, being attuned, asking for what the other needs, being patient and breathing. If you're going to allow the person who's unwell, you can think about this if you have elderly parents as well or cared for an elderly person, you need to, it may not be the most efficient approach and it may not be the most time-effective approach. Breathe. Allow that person to exercise their mastery in that moment. On the caregiving side, and I've been given the 2-minute warning by Mary, so I'm going to speak to key points rather than too quickly. Please, dependency, if I'm going to get anything across, does not make you needy. Point number 1. We're all interdependent, and Dan Weil says it best, another well-known therapist, family therapist, and marriage expert. How dependent is that person is the wrong question. Everybody is dependent. The question is, how skillful is the person at being dependent? People who are good at being dependent don't even look dependent. They just look like engaging, appreciative, responsive, and loving people who are successful in getting you to want to comfort and take care of them. Now, isn't that a twist? Being vulnerable doesn't mean you're weak. Hello, we're all vulnerable at different times and different time points. Important to express the appreciation when you've given care. I won't go into detail about that, but if we have a question later, I can elaborate. So when we listen attentively, and you can do this in both directions, but I'll encourage from the caregiver side of things, especially, you're listening to understand rather than respond. This is an idea that by many marriage therapists, David Reed at York has really emphasizes this in his work with couples, resisting the temptation to be 2 steps ahead in your mind. Presume that you don't know. Allow yourself to be curious and surprised when you speak to somebody. When you're listening attentively in your closest relationships, put down the cell phone, turn off the TV, look at the person in the eye. You don't have to do this all the time, but even if it's for a half an hour, a few times a week, making that point of making a space to listen attentively makes all the difference. Empathy is not sympathy. You know that the root of sympathy is pathos. No one feels more empowered if they feel like you've sympathized with them. But if you've made an effort to really meet them and try to understand what their experience is in an empathic way, that's an empowering experience. And also, I would encourage you, for every interaction you have, especially in the caregiving, patient and receiving, caring and receiving, giving and receiving place, ask yourself, is what I'm about to say or do going to reinforce our relationship foundation, enhance it, help it, or is it unnecessarily going to stress it? So when you're feeling like you're just wanting to blurt something out because you're pissed about something, maybe take a break. Let that reactivity settle, and then ask yourself that question. Is what I'm about to say going to improve things for the 2 of us, or 3 of us, or 4 of us, or is it going to make it worse? And I'm going to end on a wonderful quote by Brenda Yerland. She talks about just the power of listening, and she says, before going to a party, I just tell myself to listen with affection to anyone who talks to me, to be in their shoes when they talk, to try to know them without my mind pressing against theirs, or arguing or changing the subject. No, my attitude is, tell me more. This person is showing me their soul. And I would add that I don't think I'll add anything to that. Taken more sights of Tuscany, and thank you all very much for your attention.